My name is Isabel Reyes. I am 28 years old. And 17 years after my parents drove away from a semi-detached house in the Northfield district with my brother in the back seat and left me standing on the pavement with a woman I barely knew, my brother typed the name of my company into a search engine while sitting at his desk in Vancouver, and everything my family had chosen not to think about for nearly 2 decades landed quietly in his lap. I want to tell you this story from the beginning. Not from the dramatic part. Not from the part where the phone rang 4 times in 1 hour and I watched my brother's name appear on the screen and did not move to answer it. From the actual beginning. Because the beginning is where the shape of everything else was decided, and I think you deserve to understand the shape before you see what grew from it. I was 11 years old on the morning of September 3rd. My parents had been talking about the move to Canada for 8 months. My father had a brother in Vancouver, my uncle Rodrigo, who had emigrated 6 years earlier and had been sending letters home about opportunities, about the quality of life, about how much easier everything was once you got your footing. My father had found a job offer through a contact of Uncle Rodrigo's, a logistics coordinator role with a warehousing company in the Greater Vancouver area. The salary was $54,200 Canadian in the first year, which at the time converted to more than my father had earned in 3 years combined at the distribution center in Northfield. I understood all of this. I was 11, not unintelligent, and my parents had explained it to me in the way that parents explain things to children when they have already made the decision, and the explanation is really a form of announcement. What they had not explained, what I did not know until 6 weeks after they left, was that the immigration paperwork they had filed named only 3 members of our family for the initial visa application. My father, my mother, my brother Daniel, who was 8 years old and therefore younger than the age threshold that would have required a separate dependent classification at the time. I was 11. The paperwork, apparently, was easier with one child. My cousin Fernanda was 34 years old when I came to live with her. She was my mother's second cousin, which made her my second cousin once removed, which is a degree of relation that means almost nothing in practical terms except that she had a spare room and had, at some point in the preceding months, agreed to take me in temporarily while my parents established themselves in Canada and sorted out the additional paperwork to bring me over. Fernanda worked as a dental receptionist. She lived in a 2-bedroom flat on the 4th floor of a building called Ridgemont Court. She was not a cruel woman. She was not particularly warm either. She was a woman who had agreed to something she had perhaps not fully calculated, and who managed the gap between what she had agreed to and what it actually required by being consistently, quietly, slightly absent, present in the flat but not quite present in the room. The temporary arrangement lasted 7 years. Before I tell you about those 7 years, about the letters, about the phone calls that grew shorter and further apart, about the afternoon when I was 13 and Fernanda sat across from me at the kitchen table and read me the letter that contained the word paperwork, I want to ask you something first. Where are you watching this from? Is it daytime where you are? The kind of afternoon where the light has gone flat and the day hasn't decided yet what it wants to be? Or is it later, and you've come to this after the rest of your evening has settled? I ask because I find it helps with this particular story to know that someone is sitting with it. It took me a long time to be able to tell it without my voice going somewhere strange. I can tell it now, but I still prefer to know there's someone on the other side. The letters from my parents arrived with reasonable regularity during the first year. My father wrote about the apartment they were renting in a suburb called Burnaby, 2 bedrooms, a view of the mountains on clear days, a laundry room in the building that worked better than anything they'd had in Northfield. My mother wrote about Daniel's school, about how quickly he was picking up the accent, about the Filipino family next door who had invited them for dinner twice. The letters were warm. They were detailed. They described a life that sounded real and textured and present. They did not describe a timeline for when I would join it. I wrote back every 2 weeks on Sunday evenings, sitting at the small desk in my room at Fernanda's flat. I asked the same question in different forms each time. When am I coming? What is happening with the paperwork? Has there been any news? My father's responses addressed the question briefly, always near the end of the letter, always with the same general shape. Things were progressing. It was complicated. It would be soon. My mother's responses did not address it at all. By October of the following year, 13 months after they had left, the letters were arriving every 3 to 4 weeks instead of every 2. By the spring after that, they had become monthly. By the time I was 13 and had been living with Fernanda for 2 years, a letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon in March that Fernanda read in the kitchen while I was at school and left on my desk for when I came home. I came home at 4:22 in the afternoon. I saw the envelope on my desk. I sat on the edge of my bed, opened it, and read it. The letter was from my mother. It was 2 pages long. The first page was ordinary. News about Daniel, who had joined a football team and was doing well in maths. News about the apartment. A mention of a holiday they had taken to Vancouver Island in the summer. The second page was where the shape of things changed. My mother wrote that the immigration lawyer they had been working with, a man named Mr. Caldera, whose office was on West Georgia Street in Vancouver, had advised them that the process of adding a dependent to an existing permanent residency application, when that dependent had already been placed in the care of a legal guardian in the country of origin, was significantly more complicated than they had initially understood. She wrote that Mr. Caldera had told them it could take several more years. She wrote that she hoped I understood that this was not what they had wanted, that circumstances had made it difficult, that they loved me and thought about me every day. She did not use the word sorry anywhere in those 2 pages. I read them twice to be sure. Fernanda knocked on my door at 6:45 that evening and asked if I was coming to dinner. I said yes. I folded the letter back into the envelope. I put it in the drawer of my desk under a maths textbook. Then I went to the kitchen and sat down and ate pasta and answered Fernanda's questions about my school day and did not cry. That was the night I stopped waiting for an explanation. Not dramatically. Not in a moment of decision I could point to clearly. It was more like a dial being turned, slowly and without announcement, from one position to another. I had been oriented toward something, toward the idea that my parents would send for me, that the temporary arrangement would become permanent in the right direction, that the letter with the real information would eventually arrive. After that Thursday in March, the dial moved. I turned to face what was actually in front of me. What was in front of me was Fernanda's flat, Fernanda's routines, a school I had been attending for 2 years and where I had by now made 2 friends I genuinely liked, a girl named Priya, who was obsessed with civil engineering, and a boy named Tom who drew architectural floor plans in the margins of his exercise books for reasons he could not fully explain. What was in front of me was a future that I was going to have to build from whatever materials were available. I was 13 years old. I understood this with a clarity that I did not yet have the vocabulary to name. Fernanda, to her credit, enrolled me in every after-school program the school offered that didn't cost extra. Debating club, the school newspaper, a Saturday morning coding workshop that a local tech company ran in the school's computer suite from 9 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. She drove me to the Saturday sessions herself and waited in the car park reading her phone. She never mentioned it as a sacrifice. I never thanked her for it adequately, which is something I carry still. My father called on my 14th birthday at 7:30 in the evening. The call lasted 11 minutes. He said, "Happy birthday." He asked about school. He said things were still complicated with the paperwork, but that they hadn't given up. I said okay. He said he loved me. I said I know. The call ended at 7:41 p.m. I went to bed at 9 p.m. and lay in the dark for a long time looking at the ceiling, and something inside me settled into a coldness I have never quite shaken. Not a bitter cold, not an angry cold, just the cold of a room where the heating has been off long enough that you stop expecting it to come back on. I did not cry then either. I was becoming, without fully knowing it, someone who processed things laterally rather than vertically. Not down into grief. Sideways into work. I left school at 18 with strong results in maths, economics, and design technology. Fernanda came to the end-of-year assembly and sat in the 3rd row and took 2 photographs on her phone, which she emailed to me with the subject line, "Well done." Those 2 words, from a woman who expressed very little, felt enormous. I keep the email in a folder I have not deleted. I enrolled at Midland University on a partial scholarship to study quantity surveying and construction management. The program was 4 years. My scholarship covered £5,340 annually. My fees were £8,200. The remaining £2,860 I covered with a part-time job at a building supplies merchant on weekday evenings from 5:30 p.m. to 9 p.m. and full days on Saturdays. The merchant was called Harrow and Dale, and it smelled of timber and wet concrete and the particular dusty warmth of a space that has been storing heavy materials for decades. I learned, in those 4 years, the names and specifications of more construction materials than my degree strictly required. I did not consider this wasted time. In my second year, a lecturer named Dr. Patricia Osei invited me to assist with a research project she was running on cost estimation models for social housing developments. The project ran for 14 months. At the end of it, Dr. Osei wrote me a reference that described me as having an unusual combination of technical rigor and commercial instinct. I printed that reference and kept it in the same drawer where I had once kept my mother's letter about Mr. Caldera. I graduated at 22. I worked for 3 years at a mid-sized construction consultancy called Meridian Build Partners, first as a junior quantity surveyor, and then, by the end of my second year, as a project cost manager on contracts ranging from £340,000 to £2.3 million. My line manager there was a man named Stuart Vickers who told me at my 18-month review that I had a quality he described as commercially dangerous, by which he meant that I could see where money was being left on the table faster than most people twice my age. I wrote that down in the same notebook where I had written Fernandez well done and Dr. Osei's reference summary. In March of my 25th year, I left Meridian Build Partners and registered my own company, Isabel Reyes Consulting Limited. I operated from the second bedroom of the flat I was renting in the Castleford area, which cost me £1,140 per month. My initial client base was 2 contacts I had developed through Meridian, a small property developer called Ashgrove Developments and a housing association called Veritas Community Homes. My first independent contract was a cost management brief for a mixed-use development in the Sandwell area worth £1.87 million in construction value. My fee was £23,400. I signed that contract on a Tuesday morning at 10:15 a.m. at a coffee shop table with my laptop and a notepad and a flat white I had bought myself as a small deliberate ceremony. I sat with it for a moment after signing. Then I sent the signed copy back by email, closed the laptop, and walked home in the rain. Over the 3 years that followed, Isabel Reyes Consulting Ltd. grew steadily. By the time I was 28, I had 6 ongoing client relationships, a part-time project coordinator named Leanne who worked remotely from Leeds, and an annual revenue of £387,000, of which my personal drawings were £94,200 after reinvestment. I had moved from the Castleford flat to a 2-bedroom flat in a building called Marlow House that cost £1,490 per month and had a kitchen window that looked out over a canal. My parents knew I had a job in construction. They did not know I had a company. We spoke 4 or 5 times a year, Christmas, birthdays, the occasional Sunday call that one of us initiated, and that lasted between 12 and 20 minutes. The calls were civil. They were not warm. My mother asked about work in the general way that parents ask about work when they are not particularly interested in the specifics. My father asked if I was eating properly. Daniel, who is 24 and working in commercial real estate in Vancouver, sent occasional WhatsApp messages, links to articles, the odd meme, happy birthday on the right day, which I noted. None of them had ever Googled my company name, until the day that one of them had to. It was a Thursday in February. I know the exact date because I had it in my calendar, February 16th, as a day I was supposed to submit a preliminary cost plan for a new Veritas Community Homes project. I was at my desk by 7:45 a.m. I had coffee. I had the spreadsheet open. My phone was face up to my left. At 11:03 a.m., my phone lit up with a call from a number I recognized as Daniel's Canadian Mobile. I watched it ring. I did not pick up. It rang through to voicemail. At 11:06 a.m. it rang again. I watched it ring. It went to voicemail. At 11:09 a.m. it rang a third time. By this point, I had set my pen down and was simply watching the screen with a quality of attention that had nothing to do with surprise. Something inside me had gone very still in the way that a room goes quiet before a storm arrives. Not tense, just attentive. Present. Aware that the thing that was about to happen had been approaching for a long time from a direction I had not watched closely enough. At 11:12 a.m. it rang a fourth time. I picked up on the third ring. Daniel said, "Isabel?" I said, "Yes." There was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds. Long enough to be uncomfortable. Long enough for me to understand that he had not prepared for me to actually answer. He said, I was looking at a contract. A cost management contract that our company has been reviewing for a development project in Birmingham. And the consultant on the other side it says Isabel Reyes Consulting. Another pause. Is that you? I said, yes. He said, you own a company. I said, I do. I could hear him breathing. I could hear the particular sound of someone reformatting their understanding of something in real time, the small recalibrations, the mental furniture being moved. He said, how long? I said, 3 years in March. He said, Isabel, we didn't know. I said, I know you didn't. There was a silence after that which lasted long enough that I stood up from my desk and walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the canal. A narrow boat was moving slowly through the gray February water, its roof painted green and yellow, someone standing at the stern in a red jacket. I watched it until it moved past the frame of the window. Daniel said, Mom and Dad, they need to know about this. I said, that's up to you. He said, Isabel. I said, Daniel, I have a cost plan to submit today. Can we talk properly at the weekend? He said, yes. Yes, of course. And then, after another pause, I'm sorry. I don't know what that's worth. But I am. I said, I'll talk to you at the weekend. And I ended the call. I stood at the kitchen window for another few minutes. The narrow boat was gone. The canal was flat and gray and moving slowly, the way water moves when there is no wind and no particular hurry. Then I went back to my desk and finished the cost plan and submitted it at 3:47 p.m., 4 minutes ahead of the deadline. The weekend call happened on Saturday, February 18th, at 2 p.m. Daniel had told my parents. My mother called at 9:14 a.m. that morning, before the scheduled call, before I had finished my first cup of coffee. I watched her name on the screen for 2 full rings and then answered. She said, Daniel told us. I said, I know. She said, why didn't you tell us you had a company? Why didn't you say anything? I thought about that question for a moment. The honest answer was, because you did not ask. Because our calls lasted 15 minutes and covered the same 10 square inches of surface. Because the last time you asked me a specific question about my work was in 2021 when you asked if I was still at the same firm, and when I said I'd left to start my own practice, you said, that sounds brave, and moved on to asking about Daniel's new apartment. But I did not say any of that. I said, it didn't come up. She said, Isabel, that's not. You should have told us. Something like that. Your own company. We are your parents. And there it was. That particular sentence. The weight of it arriving in the same breath as the hurt, the same breath as the ownership claim. We are your parents. I have thought about that sentence many times since that Saturday morning. About the tense of it. The present tense. We are. As though there had been no September 3rd, no paperwork, no letter about Mr. Caldera, no 11-minute birthday phone call that ended at 7:41 p.m. As though the category of parent operated independently of the actions that fill it. I said, I have to get ready for the 2 o'clock call. She said, we need to talk properly, Isabel. Not just a call. I said, we can talk on Saturday. She said, I mean in person. Your father and I have been talking. We think we would like to come and visit. To see where you live. We haven't seen your flat. I was quiet for a moment. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but because I wanted to say it correctly. Precisely. Without extra weight attached. I said, I need some time to think about that. She said, Isabel. I said, I'll talk to you at 2. And I ended the call. I put the phone down on the kitchen counter. I stood with both hands flat on the counter and looked at the surface of it. The pale gray stone, a small water ring near the tap that I hadn't wiped away yet, the edge of the chopping board. I stayed there for perhaps 3 minutes. I was not crying. I was not shaking. I was doing what I have always done with the large things, staying with them quietly until they stopped moving, until I could see their actual shape rather than the shape my feelings were making around them. The shape of what my mother had said was, "We are your parents." The shape of what she meant was, "We have a claim." The shape of what I knew was, the claim had been renegotiated, silently, over 17 years, in every letter that arrived monthly instead of fortnightly, in every phone call that covered surfaces and moved on, in every year that passed in Fernanda's flat while my brother was growing up in a suburb with a view of the mountains. I poured the rest of my coffee down the sink. Then I called my solicitor, a woman named Andrea Callowell, who handles my business contracts and had once, in passing, mentioned that she also advised on family matters when they intersected with business interests. I told her the situation. I asked her what my position was if the family relationship now created complications with the commercial contract Daniel's company was evaluating. She told me clearly, the two were entirely separate. The business relationship could proceed or not proceed on its commercial merits, regardless of the personal relationship. No obligation ran in either direction from the family connection. I thanked her and ended the call at 10:47 a.m. The 2 o'clock call with both parents and Daniel lasted 31 minutes. My mother cried twice. My father said very little, which had always been his way, but toward the end said, in a voice I did not recognize immediately as his, "I should have fought harder for the paperwork. I have thought about that for a long time. I want you to know that." I said, "I hear you." I did not say, "That is enough," because it wasn't enough. But it was the first true thing he had said to me in a very long time, and I was willing to receive it without immediately measuring its weight. At 2:47 p.m. I told them I needed to go. I had a Sunday prep session for a client meeting on Monday morning. That was true. I ended the call. The contract situation resolved itself practically. Daniel's company withdrew from the bidding process on February 22nd. He sent me a message that said simply, "Conflict of interest."
Didn't feel right.
I did not ask him to elaborate. I noted the gesture and filed it somewhere in the same general category as Fernanda's well done. Small true things from people who had not always managed to be present, offered when they finally had the capacity. Andrea Callowell sent me the updated client file for the Veritas project on February 23rd at 9:15 a.m. I opened it at my desk, coffee to the left, canal out the window catching the pale February light, the Marlowe house building quiet around me. I am 20 years old, and I built something real. I want to say that plainly, without performance, because it is the most important sentence in this story, and the one I spent the longest time learning to say without immediately qualifying it into smaller pieces. I built a company from a spare bedroom and a second-hand laptop and 3 years of evenings at Harrow and Dale and 4 years of a degree I partly funded myself, and every Saturday morning in a school computer suite where Fernanda waited in the car park reading her phone without ever once making me feel that her time was worth more than mine. There is something I want to say about the experience of being built by absence because I think it is genuinely misunderstood. People assume that being left damages you in one direction only, that the damage is always the same shape, hollow, needy, permanently turned toward the people who left. For some people, perhaps it is. For me, the absence did something different. It removed the option of waiting. When there is no one coming, you stop standing at the window and you start building the thing yourself. That is not a virtue I claimed. It is a condition I was placed in. The distinction matters. I am not grateful for being left. I am clear-eyed about what it made necessary. The question of my parents, of whether they visit, of whether we build something that functions, is not one I have answered yet. I told them I needed time. That remains true. What I know is that the answer will come from me, on a timeline I choose, and that no claim of "we are your parents" will accelerate it. They're my parents. They are also the people who filed paperwork that named 3 members of our family and left me on a pavement in Northfield on a September morning. Both of those things are true simultaneously. I have stopped trying to resolve the contradiction and started simply living alongside it. There is a narrowboat that passes my kitchen window most mornings around 8:30. Green and yellow, the same one I watched on the day Daniel called. Someone moves it through the gray water at a pace that suggests no urgency and no anxiety. The pace of someone who knows where they're going and does not need to rush. I've started to think of it as a useful image. Not as a metaphor exactly, just as a thing that moves at its own pace through its own channel and does not require an audience to justify the journey. What you build in the absence of other people belongs to you in a way that nothing built for them ever quite does. That is both the cost of it and the thing it gives you. You pay in loneliness. You receive in ownership. Whether the trade was worth making is not a question I was given a choice about. So I have stopped asking it. If you were in Isabel's place, if your brother called 4 times in 1 hour and the thing he had found was the company you built while your family was not watching, would you have answered that 4th call? Or would you have let it go to voicemail, the way the title of this story suggests, and called back on your own terms? I want to know where you land. Leave it in the comments. I read everyone.